about a man who suffers with his life, and he goes to the woods and there, and he lives for years. Um, he meets people, but they are not real people. And then after he comes back, and he will find that America has changed, and his wife and everyone he knew died.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is not how it used to be.
That everything has actually changed. Yes? Move on.
And as I said, everyone will be gone. Like so many people will die, and he will be an old man. His daughter will be married, and he will find that America is a free country. It's not a British colony anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much, Shahinas. Actually, it's sorry. This is a story of a man who was uh I'm sorry, I'm going to remove this from my head. Now, if you speak, I will not be able to hear you. There was a lot of noise in my ears, so I had to remove um my speakers. Someone is raising their hand. Sana, yes, you can speak, Sana. Do you have something to say? You can activate your microphone and speak, Sana, if you have something to say. Maybe not. All right. So,
I'm sorry, miss. Sorry, can I speak?
yes.
I just have some noise here. That's why I'm so sorry. About
Okay.
concerning Rip Van Winkle, the short story. It's
Mhm.
a story telling. I'm sorry. The text is tells the story of a Dutch American villager in colonial America, named Rip Van Winkle, who lived exactly in Catskills Mountains. And one autumn day, he tried to escape from his nagging wife and his responsibility at home by wandering into the mountains, where he met some Dutchman who gave him a mysterious liquor or wine that caused falling him asleep for 20 years, meeting the American Revolution. So this is a short summary writing by me.
In a nutshell. All right. Thank you very much, Sana. That was more or
Welcome.
less that was the main story in a few words. So yeah, Rip Van Winkle was a man of a Dutch ancestry, and while you are reading the story, you are going to find a lot of references to the Dutch ancestry, and we're going to go back to that and see why the author insisted on that so much. So in the beginning, we are first told about his Dutch ancestry, who were very strong-minded, and even physically they were strong. They were known by their great legends and so on. And then we are told about this man who was handpicked. That is, he was usually uh, he was, let's say, he was usually I'm not going to say scared of his wife, but he had a very strong wife, or his wife was much stronger than he was, and he was merely lazy. He was doing things for the others, but not doing things for his own home and for his own self. So he was lazy in his own house, but he was very active, sorry, for the others. And this man was uh, loved nature. He loved everyone around him. Everyone around him loved him too. And he is actually very symbolic. He is, in a way, symbolic of the main American character or the American individual for so many years. So in the beginning of the story, he goes up to the mountain in the Catskill Mountains with his dog Wolf, and he meets a number of people who were somehow awkward, who did not look like usual human beings. They were playing at ninepins. He drank the liquor with them. He slept for 20 years. When he woke up, he went back to his village and everything has changed. He couldn't recognize anyone around him. He couldn't recognize the people in the village. Neither of them could recognize him, and they took him, or rather they thought that he was a spy, or that he was a um, that he was supporting the old regime or the old government that is before the revolution, because he didn't realize that there was actually an independence, that America was now an independent country. The greatest news he had heard when he went back to his village was about the death of his wife, and which is, according to some critics, a reference to Britain. That is, he was happy to hear about his wife, the woman who was scaring him or terrifying him for so long, is no longer there, which is a reference to the power of Britain and the American citizen or the American individual who was terrified by the British kingdom or the British monarchy. And now that it's an independent country, there is no longer this terrifying force or this terrifying power that would scare him or deprive him of his freedom. Yet, Rip Van Winkle could not cope with the change. He could not cope with the new modern world, the independent country. So he was still living in his past memories. He was still living in his past memories of in his own America. So even though he knew that it was an independent America, that the sources of pressure over him were no longer there, but he couldn't cope with the change. And this is also actually interpreted by some critics as the American individual and his inability to cope with the change, and to develop with the industrialization, and to develop with the quick I'm sorry, I cannot find my words today. I was with the quick progress of technology. Yeah, all right. So he is more or less compared to, I'm not going to say compared to, but for many critics, he is a symbol of the usual American individual who cannot, who was happy to end his life under colony, as a colony or as a colonized subject. But being an independent American, a lot of people were having trouble in finding themselves, in finding their new identity, in coping with the change, in advancing and coping with this technological progress, and most particularly in finding their ways and finding their lives. Okay. The West in America was referred to as the Wild West, and many texts from the period reflect this area as showing many difficulties, merely for the lower classes and the middle classes in finding wealth. I wouldn't say wealth, but in finding income. Okay. So even though a lot of people have been traveling to America to become rich, they realized that once they were there, they realized that it wasn't easy as it was depicted before. It wasn't as easy as it was waged for before. So this is what more or less what we are seeing in this literature. That is, the fact that Rip Van Winkle couldn't cope with the change or couldn't live like the people who were living around him, and preferred instead to stay in his bubble, you know, in the past, in his past memories, was merely related to the difficulty of establishing a new American character, a new American identity, and to expand. Let me just read your comments. The lazy, hand-picked husband who represented America, and his wife who made his life hard as she represented the UK. Yes, very good. The dwarfs, very good. Thank you. Yes. So one of the things that actually make the text that is from Rip Van Winkle a romantic text are the inspirations from the past. That is, unlike transcendentalism, which considers the past as a source of information but focus is on the present, remember, the romantics have a nostalgia for the past. And what Washington Irving did in Rip Van Winkle, by inspiring from the past and by making so many references to the past, is actually the idea of creating a history for America. Okay? You know, America is a new nation. It's a new country. It doesn't have a very long past. Well, if we're speaking about the past that is composed of the white people, because the natives were there for a very long time. But Washington Irving was trying to create this aspect of the myth and legend in order to create a sort of a canon for American literature. So he inspired from the past in order to include the aspect of the mysterious, the aspects of the supernatural, and to create a form of myth and of legend in the American character and the American culture. So one more romantic element in the story was also the element of the revolution. So even though he was Rip Van Winkle was a hand-picked husband, even though even after the revolution, he didn't do much in order to cope with the change. But the entire story, the entire idea of getting rid of that power that was practicing pressure, or that was representing a form of pressure or authoritarian regime over the main character, that it was swept away, and that now we have a new regime and a new way of living, a more freedom. This in itself represents or stands for the theme of revolution. And remember that in the beginning of Romanticism in Britain, we were speaking of the revolution and liberation. The earliest fathers of Romanticism in Britain, that is Wordsworth and Coleridge, were calling for a political revolution. They were calling for liberation. So this is more or less the same idea of liberation and revolution, but it is embedded in a different story. It is embedded, or it is written differently, using the aspects of the supernatural and more fiction. Okay, and this is the idea of symbolism. Symbolism is also one of the main aspects of Romanticism, which we haven't spoken about before in British Romanticism, because there wasn't much symbolism in its poetry. But in American literature is full of symbolism, especially the Romantic literature. So yes, Fatima, it's a fantasy. Sana, when we write a visual analysis about that story, how can we mention the symbols? Well, just like I did, Sana, when you are speaking about the symbols, you can give interpretations to the characters and to the events. For example, the wife being a symbol of the UK, of Great Britain. So her power, her hegemony over the main character, that is over Rip, her strength over Rip, all that is represented in the character, or is a reference to the power of the UK and the kind of pressure it was practicing over the American character or the American individual. Now I should switch to the text. Do you see the text? Please let me know. Activate your microphone and answer. Do you see the text? All right. Fatima, what made Rip Van Winkle sleep for 20 years? It was actually the liquor that he drank with the dwarves on the mountain. Okay. So Rip Van Winkle, sorry. Rip Van Winkle actually, Washington Irving actually chose the landscape on purpose. That is, he made it very rich. He chose the landscape on purpose. He thought that in order to represent the American culture correctly or adequately, he had to go back in the past, very far in the past, but also very far physically, okay, or geographically. This is why he went to rather he depicted a very strong nature and very wild nature to emphasize his goal or his theme. Now, I'm going to go over a very short reading of the text, and I will attempt to do the analysis by my own. I usually do the analysis with the help of the students. Now, if you think you want to participate in the analysis, that would be really great to me. If otherwise, I will be doing it by my own. Now, I don't think I will need to identify the passage for you. I guess the passage is very clear. It's taken from Rip Van Winkle, a short story, romantic short story written by Washington Irving in 1820. So the main character we're talking about is Rip Van Winkle. Now, as I start reading here, I'm speaking about Rip Van Winkle. This is from the beginning of the story. He says, he inherited, however, but little of the martial character of his ancestors. I have observed that he was a simple, good-natured man. He was, moreover, a kind neighbor and an obedient, hand-pecked husband. So this is a description of the character. Now, remember that the characters must be thoroughly described, okay? In second year, because we didn't have much time in order to speak about each character in detail, we had to go over them very quickly. But in third year, you are going to devote more time to the characterization, and you are going to be evaluated on that too, okay? So it's very important that you describe the characters correctly and adequately when speaking about them. Analyze the character, okay? Do not just say mention the name of the character and say whether they are protagonist or antagonist and go on, okay? You have to describe the character and analyze them. Extract your own conclusions about the character. For example, the main character here, Rip Van Winkle, is described as hand-packed, good-natured, but he was also a kind neighbor and an obedient husband. Okay, so these two are two, let's say, opposing characteristics. Especially if you look back at the beginning of the sentence, it says he inherited, however, but little of the martial character of his ancestors. So now we know that his Dutch ancestors were very strong people. They were very strong, not only physically, but also strong-minded people. But now he's not, this man is not depicted as having a strong personality as his ancestors. He is very weak and he's very submissive to his wife. And maybe even this can be considered as a symbol for the European character or the European individual living in America, because most of the Europeans or most of the modern Americans came originally from Europe. So while living in Europe, maybe they had strong personalities and were very strong-minded and so on. But while living in America, they became weak, especially under the control of Great Britain or of the UK. They lost their strong characters and they became submissive. They were submissive to the British monarchy. Okay, so when you are speaking about character, try to extract your own conclusions and show them in your analysis of the character. Now, next paragraph, certain it is that he was a great favorite among all the good wives of the village, who, as usual with the amiable sex, took his part in all family squabbles and never failed, whenever they talked those matters over in their evening gossipings, to lay all the blame on Dame Van Winkle. That is, all the people always thought that it was his wife who was wrong, his wife was a bad person, but never himself being a bad person. The children of the village, too, would shout with joy whenever he approached. He assisted at their sports, made their playthings, taught them to fly kites, shoot marrows, and told them long stories of ghosts, witches, and Indians. Whenever he went dodging about the village, he was surrounded by a troop of them, hanging on his skirts, clambering on his back, and playing thousand tricks on him with impunity, and not a dog would bark at him throughout the neighborhood. So now we see that he was very popular in the neighborhood, not only with the in the family squabbles, but also with the children, and even the dogs around him loved him. Everyone loved Rip. Nobody ever had the least problem with him, unless his wife. Now, I have skipped a few paragraphs from the story while selecting this excerpt. So the paragraphs that I have skipped speak about a small quarrel between him and his wife, in which his wife was shouting at him. And the next paragraph I'm going to read comes after the conflict between him and his wife. So, poor Rip, see that he is often referred to as poor. That is, you feel like the author is having a sort of a sympathy for him, okay? So now you can see the tone of the author. The tone of the author is very clear. The author feels pity for Rip. He feels sympathy for Rip, okay? Poor Rip was reduced almost to despair, and his only alternative to escape from the labor of the farm and the clamor of his wife was to take gun in hand and stroll away into the woods. So he was escaping the clamors of his wife. He was escaping the blames of his wife and going to the mountain. Now, does this remind you of any of the principles of Romanticism you've seen before? Any answer? Hello?
Miss,
Yes?
it reminds me with nature as a source of spirituality or something.
Yeah, nature as a form of refuge, as a refuge. Okay, nature was his only refuge, and remember, for the Romantics, nature represented the refuge. They escaped to nature in order to find peace and tranquility. Okay, now Fatima, in order to answer your question, the period that we're speaking about here, that is in the setting of the story, is before the this is during the revolution, before the independence. Okay, the period we're speaking about here in the story. This is not the period of the author, but this is the time setting of the story, okay, of the events of the story. So according to the events of the story, this was during the revolution and right before the independence. That is when Rip Van Winkle went to the mountain and slept for 20 years. America was having its revolution, but there was no independence. Okay. Please, Amina, deactivate your microphone.
Yes, Miss. I said, what was your question?
Sorry?
What was your question? I didn't hear you.
Okay. It's okay, no problem. I'm going to take care of this. So back to the text. So he said that the fact that he found he always found refuge and tranquility in nature. That is, even though his wife was, or rather, living in society or living with his wife came as a form of torment for him. It was a torture. It was a punishment for him. But he only found freedom and escape in nature. Okay, so by understanding what Rip Van Winkle was experiencing both in society and in nature, you can understand the basic principles of Romanticism. Here he would sometimes seat himself at the foot of a tree and share the content of his wallet with Wolf. Now Wolf is his dog, with whom he sympathized as a fellow sufferer in persecution. Now he considered Wolf as a fellow sufferer in persecution. I love the way it is expressed here. Fellow, that is a companion or someone who belongs to the same group. Sufferer in persecution, considering that Wolf was also handpicked by his partner, okay, or by his wife. That is, he considered that even his dog Wolf was ill-treated by his wife. So he says, "Poor Wolf," he would say, "thy mistress, that is your mistress, leads thee a dog's life of it." That is, your mistress is giving you a dog's life. Your mistress is giving you a hard time. "But never mind, my lad, that is my friend. Whilst I live, thou shalt never want a friend to stand by thee." That is, while I am alive, you will never need a friend as long as I am here. Notice that the author is using an archaic language here. He is using a very ancient language. This is not the language of the 18th century, even though this was written of the 19th century. Sorry, even though this was written in the 19th century, but the author made it on purpose to use these archaic words, and this is again to put this archaic and this very ancient and antique aspect to the text. As I said in the beginning, it was Washington Irving's attempt to create the legendary and the mythical in American literature. Okay, Wolf would wag his tail, look wistfully in his master's face, and if dogs can feel pity, I verily believe he reciprocated the sentiment with all his heart. That is, not only Rip was feeling pity for Wolf, it was Wolf too who was feeling pity for Rip. That is, even the dog was feeling that Rip was not okay, that Rip was ill-treated by his wife. All right. In a long ramble of the kind on a fine autumnal day, Rip had unconsciously scrambled to one of the highest parts of the Catskill Mountains. He was after his favorite sport of squirrel shooting, and the still solitudes had echoed and re-echoed with the reports of his gun. Now, I want you to imagine the scene that we are going to read. Okay, there will be many things. A landscape is going to be described, and I want you to do your best to imagine this landscape. So I'm going back to the text. Panting and fatigued, he threw himself late in the afternoon on a green knoll, covered with mountain herbage that crowned the brow of a precipice. From an opening between the trees, he could overlook at the lower country from a mile of rich woodland. He saw at a distance the lordly Hudson. Actually, the lordly Hudson is a reference to the river, to the Hudson River. And you see the word lordly Hudson, which means that the river was really huge and very deep. Okay. He saw at a distance the lordly Hudson, far, far below him, moving on its silent but majestic course. Have a look at the choice of words. While the river is described, it is described as majestic and lordly and silently moving. So you feel like he's not just talking about a river, he's talking about much more than a river. And that's because the river is named after Hudson, who was a hero in this area. Okay? So, but this also refers to the greatness of nature, of the landscape, and of the area he is speaking about. With the reflection of a purple cloud or the sail of a lagging bark, here and there sleeping on its glassy bosom. Okay, the reflection of a purple cloud, which shows again that this river is really huge, it's big. It's a purple cloud, so this is the end of the day. Or the sail of a lagging bark, here and there sleeping in its glassy bosom. And at last losing itself in the blue highlands, that is in the horizon. On the other side, he looked down into the deep mountain glen, wild, lonely, and shagged, the bottom filled with fragments from the impending cliffs, and scarcely lighted by the reflected rays of the setting sun. For some time, Ripley musing at this scene. So he was lying down and he was musing at the scene. He was enjoying the scene. Okay. Evening was gradually advancing. The mountains began to throw their blue shadows over the valleys. He saw that it would be dark long before he could reach the village, and he heaved a heavy sigh when he thought of encountering the terrors of Dame Van Winkle. Yeah. Could someone comment on this paragraph, please? I would love to hear your views about the paragraph. Anyone? Now I'm reading your questions. Yes? Someone is speaking? Someone was talking? I'm reading your questions here. Amina said, what is meant by archaic? Something archaic is something very ancient, antique, something very, very old. Okay? Now, is there a relationship between this story and Romanticism? Yes, Fatima. Everything in this story is romantic. This entire story is romantic. It is all based on romantic aspects. Okay? The fact that it inspires from the past, the fact that it is set in the past, the fact that some aspects never even existed in American culture, but they are there. That's the aspect of the supernatural. There is also the mysterious, the inspiration of from nature, the peace that he finds, that Rip actually finds in nature. All that is romanticism. Is there any aspects of transcendentalism here? No, Sana, there isn't much transcendentalism as much as there is romanticism. This is more romantic than transcendental. Okay? Now, let's go back to the text. Now, if you would notice that the descriptions of the text, they are not just related to nature alone. He's not just describing nature like anything. You feel like the author actually venerates nature. You feel like the author actually finds this peace and tranquility in nature. And he is reflecting, or rather, he is referring these natural aspects or these elements from nature to heroic and legendary figures like the figure of Hudson. And not only he's in his description of the river, he's bringing back the glorifying characteristics of the hero that the river is called after. So he is referred to as majestic, as lordly, okay? And you feel like nature in this text has a spirit. Nature is vivid in the text. See the sentence that I've highlighted here in yellow? It says, the mountains began to throw their long blue shadows over the valleys. Now, in terms of figures of speech, which figure of speech is that? Hello, are you following?
Miss personification? Or
Very good. Yes, thank you. This is a personification, right? So he is actually giving life to inanimate bodies. Now, the mountains do not actually move, but the way he's describing the mountains, the way he's describing everything actually in that place, gives it a sort of a spirit and magic. It makes he's actually making this nature something strong. He's given a character to nature. All right. So I'm going to move to the next paragraph. On entering the amphitheater. All right. So there was I have cut some paragraphs here right between the two paragraphs. The paragraph I have removed is a paragraph in which Rib was walking back in the mountain, and he heard a voice calling his name. And when he followed the voice, he found a gate. So he crossed the gate and he found an amphitheater. All right? So on entering the amphitheater, new objects of wonder presented themselves. Now, objects of wonder, this is a way of saying bizarre objects, things that are different and new, things that he had never seen before. Okay? Presented themselves. This is again a personification because things do not present themselves. His sight was actually discovering them. So you can see that the text is actually full of figures of speech. On a level spot in the center was a company of odd-looking personages playing at 9 pins. That is, they were personages, that is, creators, and he refers to them as odd-looking because they looked different, they looked bizarre. Okay, so at the center was a company of odd-looking personages playing at 9 pins. They were dressed in quaint, outlandish fashion. That is, they looked outlandish. They looked different, and they looked like they came from an outer world. They came from a different place. Their fashion was different and bizarre. It was alien. Some wore short doublets, others jerkins with long knives in their belts, and most of them had enormous breeches of similar style with that of the guide. Their visages, too, were peculiar. One had a large head, a broad face, and small piggish eyes. The face of another seemed to consist entirely of a nose, and was surmounted by a white sugar-loaf hat, set off with a little red cock's tail. They all had beards of various shapes and colors. There was one who seemed to be the commander. He was a stout old gentleman with a weather-beaten countenance. He wore lace doublets, broad belt hanger, high-crowned hat, and red stockings, and high-heeled shoes with roses in them. Now, I love the shoes, don't you? The whole group reminded Rip of the figures in an old Flemish painting in the parlor dominated by Van Schaik, the village parson, and which had been brought over from Holland at the time of the settlement. What seemed particularly odd to Rip was that though these folks were evidently amusing themselves, yet they maintained the gravest face, the most mysterious silence, and were withal the most melancholy party of pleasure he had ever witnessed. Nothing interrupted the stillness of the scene but the noise of the balls, which, whenever they were rolled, echoed along the mountain like rumbling peals of thunder. Now, what do you think of the appearance of these creatures? What do you think of the way they looked, the way they are described in this paragraph? Anyone?
They are described as people from another nation.
Can you repeat, please?
They are described as people from another.
Yes, they are described as alien, as coming from a different place. But again, what do you think of them? They had colored beards, they had red stockings, and even high-heeled shoes with roses. One of them had a face composed of a nose. The other one has a huge face, a very large face, but piggish eyes like the eyes of a pig, very small eyes. Yes? What do you think of these descriptions? Are they just different? Yes? Someone was talking?
I said that the way they describe them shows that racism. It shows racism.
Why racism?
Because they describe them as different people. They talk about their hair and their, you know.
Well, they were in fact made on purpose. They were made different on purpose.
Miss,
Yes?
they can be stranger or spy
Yes, they are stranger. They are
or
strangers.
spy or spy.
Sorry?
Spy.
As spies.
Yes.
No, actually, they stand for the supernatural aspect of the text. Okay? Now,
Yeah.
think about this. Are there spies who only have a nose in their face and nothing else? He said the face of one of them looked to consist entirely of a nose, nothing more than a nose. What do you think of that? Now, this is the aspect of the supernatural. Let me see what Sabrina has to say. She says, Rip hurried by the nagging of his wife, so he wandered into the Catskill near his home. Then he fell asleep for 20 years. He met mysterious Dutchmen, drank their liquor, and fell asleep. Yes, he did. Okay, so if you would pay attention to the small details here in the descriptions of these characters or these personages, as referred to in the text, you will notice the aspect of the supernatural. They are supernatural. They are not normal human beings. And this is how Washington Irving actually includes the aspect of the supernatural and the exotic. Remember that in Romanticism, there's always this aspect of the extreme experiences, the will to find something new, to write and imagine something new, as well as the power of imagination. So he says they were dressed in an outlandish fashion. Some of them, their visages were very particular. One of them had a very large head and small, piggish eyes. So a normal person cannot look like that. The face of another seemed to consist entirely of a nose. That is, he doesn't have a face. There is only a nose there. Okay. What was the next one? Surmounted by a white sugar loaf hat. That is, he has a nose. There is a nose in this face and has a white sugar loaf hat. And that's all. And set off with a red cock's tail, and he has a cock's tail. So they all had beards, and the beards were colored. All right. So these characters seem funny, they seem comic, but also seem bizarre and supernatural. All right. But then we are done with their funny appearance or with their funny countenance. He says, what seemed particularly odd to Rip was that these folks were evidently amusing themselves. Yes, they were playing. We could see that they are amusing themselves. They are playing at ninepins, but they maintained the gravest face. Their faces were very serious. The most mysterious silence. They were very silent. They were playing, but they were very silent. And were withal the most melancholy party of pleasure he had ever witnessed. That is, they didn't seem to be enjoy, or they didn't seem to be having fun. Their faces were very serious. They were not smiling. They were not making the least noise. Yet, he could see that they were amusing themselves and that they were having fun. Okay? So this is an analogy. I love the analogy that he made here in this sentence. They were the most melancholy party of pleasure he had ever witnessed. Okay? I love the paradox here in this sentence. He puts on melancholy and pleasure at the same sentence. Nothing interrupted the stillness of the scene but the noise of the balls which, whenever they were rolled, echoed along the mountains like rumbling peals of thunder. Okay, because everything was so quiet, but whenever they rolled these balls, they sounded like thunder. They were very strong. Okay, this entire scene is meant to prepare the reader's mind for something supernatural. Okay, now the paragraphs that I have omitted refer to or rather speak about Rip drinking from the liquor with these characters and sleeping for 20 years. Okay, that is, he has drank from their liquor and fell asleep. So Rip wakes up after 20 years, but is still not aware of how long he slept. At length, he reached to where the ravine had opened through the cliffs. Now he is trying to go back to his village, okay? So he is trying to find the gate, which was open in the cliffs, the gate through which he had entered to find the amphitheater and these small creatures. So he reached to where the ravine had opened through the cliffs to the amphitheater, but no traces of such opening remained. He couldn't find the gate anymore. The rocks presented a high, impenetrable wall. So there were rocks there, and they made a wall, which shows that nobody came to that place for 20 years. There were some cliffs there before, but then since nobody had walked that path for 20 years, there were rocks that formed a wall there. The rocks presented a high, impenetrable wall over which the torrent came tumbling in a sheet of feathery foam and fell into a broad, deep basin, black from the shadows of the surrounding forest. Here, then, poor Rick was brought to a stand. Here again called, he again called and whistled after his dog. He was only answered by the crowing of a flock of idle crows. So he was trying to find his dog, but instead of finding his dog, he was answered by crows. Do you know what is meant by a crow? Anyone? Yes? No one? Okay, I'm reading Sabrina here. He woke up knowing how long he slept. Found the world very
Crow,
strange. Yes?
crow is a bird.
Yes, there are black birds that usually in literature and in culture. Yes?
غراب.
Yes, very good. Usually in literature and culture, the crows are related or are connected to melancholy and Gothicism. Okay? And you are going to notice that the text, which began with very optimistic view of nature, is now going to turn to Gothicism. It's all going to turn to pessimism. Everything that was beautiful in the beginning is now going to become something scary and dark. All right? So in the beginning, he found a very beautiful gate through which he entered to the amphitheater and found objects of wonder and so on. Now he only found rocks. And while trying to find his dog is not responding. Instead of being responded by his dog, so if he finds his dog is his best friend. If he finds the dog, he's going to be very happy. Instead of finding the dog, he's answered by the crows. And since the crows are related or connected to pessimism and darkness, so this is meant to show some aspect of deceit and aspect of negativity in the character or in the psychology of Rip. Sporting high in the air about a dry tree and overhang a sunny precipice. See, earlier when we were talking about the trees in the previous paragraphs, the trees were represented as green and beautiful and so on, but now it's a dry tree. Even the trees are not beautiful anymore, okay? And who, secure in their elevation, seem to look down and scoff at the poor man's perplexities. That is, the crows were in the sky. They were looking at at Rip, but they were somehow musing at his perplexities. They were somehow musing at his discomfort. What was to be done? The morning was passing away, and Rip felt famished for want of his breakfast. The only thing that Rip is thinking about is that I am hungry. All right? He wants his breakfast. He is hungry. He grieved to give up his dog and gun. He dreaded to meet his wife, but it would not do to starve among the mountains. He didn't want to leave his dog and his gun. He was grieving. He didn't want to leave them. He still wanted to find them in the mountain. And he didn't want to see his wife. He thought it was dreadful that he had to meet his wife. But he was starving for his breakfast. It was hunger that drove him to his house, that drove him back to his wife. After all, he hasn't eaten for 20 years, okay? He shook his head, shouldered the rusty firelock, and with a heart full of trouble and anxiety, turned his steps homeward. That is, even though he still wanted to find his dog and so on, he had to go back home, so he was very sad and felt anxious, but still needed to go back to his home. Let me see your comments. Fatima, I will send you the method of literature analysis later. Just remind me to do it. Sabrina, he returned to the village, but he wasn't recognized. And his wife mentioned after 20 years of sleeping, was she still alive? Sabrina, this is the moment he woke up. He's still in the mountain. He just woke up. He was trying to find his dog and gun. He's still in the mountain, so he doesn't know that he slept for 20 years. For the moment, he thinks that he slept for only one night. Okay? So, he shook his head. All right, he feels anxious, and now he thinks of going back to the village. So now that he goes back to the village, he will discover that he slept for 20 years, and he will discover that his wife was no longer alive. As he approached the village, he met a number of people, but none of them he knew. Sorry, there's a key lacking here. Okay, sorry. But none of whom he knew. All right, so he went back to the village. Remember, in the beginning of the text, we said that all the neighbors knew him, all the neighbors loved him, all the children loved him, all the dogs loved him, and so on. Now he went back to the village, but he could not recognize anybody in the village, and likewise, nobody could recognize him. So, as he approached the village, he met a number of people, but none of whom he knew, which somewhat surprised him. He was surprised that he couldn't recognize people. He usually knows everyone. For he had thought himself acquainted for everyone in the country around. Their dress, that is the way these people were dressed, their fashion. Their dress, too, was of a different fashion from that which he was accustomed. Okay? He slept for 20 years. People's way of dressing has changed, but he doesn't know that. So their way of dressing seems awkward and bizarre to him. They all stared at him with equal marks of surprise. And whenever they cast their eyes upon him, invariably stroked their chins. You know, you see someone and you are shocked and you would touch your chin. You know, the chin is the bottom of your face. You know, if you are shocked, you do, and you are touching your mouth, you are touching the chin. This is what people were actually doing whenever they saw him. So they all stared at him with equal remarks of surprise. All people were surprised at him. And whenever they cast their eyes upon him, that is, whenever their eyes came over him, invariably stroked their chin. They all touched their chins of surprise because of surprise and shock. The constant recurrence of this gesture induced Rip involuntarily, to do the same. That is, when Rip saw that all people were shocked at him and touching their skin because they were shocked, he started doing the same thing. He thought that was a common action to be done between these people, so he started doing the same thing. So the constant recurrence of this gesture, that is the gesture of touching their skin involuntarily, induced Rip to do the same. When, to his astonishment, he found his beard had grown a foot long. So that is, when he started touching his chin like people, he discovered that he has a beard, and not only a beard, but a beard that is 1 foot long. Okay? He had now entered the skirts of the village. That is, now he's inside the village. A troop of strange children ran at his heels, hooting after him, pointing his gray head. Okay, his gray beard. So now, in the beginning, we were told that all the children loved him. Now the children don't love him. They don't recognize him, and they are running after him to make fun of him. They are pointing at his beard. The dogs too. Remember what we said about the dogs in the beginning of the text? We said that all the dogs never barked at him, and all the dogs loved him. Now the dogs too not one of which he recognized for an old acquaintance. Yeah, the dogs were his friends. They all barked at him as he passed. Okay? So see that everything has changed in his life and everything is opposite to what was described in the beginning of the story. Seems like the author has taken the first part of the story and started writing the opposite. Okay? Let me see your comments. The poor was surrounded by questions, and he didn't even recognize if himself or someone else, finding himself changed, couldn't even remember his name. Exactly. Yes, he couldn't recognize himself, and he couldn't recognize the things around him. Okay. Now, the very village was altered for him. The entire village has changed. Okay, altered means changed. It was larger and more populous. That is, in the past, there were more people in the village. There were rows of houses which he had never seen before. No, not in the past. That is, the new village he found included more people than it used to do in the past. And there are more houses than he was familiar to, okay, or familiar with. And those which had been his familiar haunts he had disappeared. Okay, there is the houses he was familiar to didn't exist anymore. They don't. They have disappeared. Strange names were over the doors, strange faces at the windows. Everything was strange. His mind now misgave him. That is, his mind is no longer able to think. He is tired of thinking. He began to doubt whether both he and the world around him were not bewitched. He started to think that he was bewitched. See, this is the very ancient, archaic way of thinking that if something is wrong, he has been bewitched. You know what is meant by bewitched? That is, he was a victim of witchhood. Something did something of witchhood to him. Surely this was his native village. He could recognize his native village, which he had left but the day before. There stood the Catskill Mountains. Now, this is Rip talking to himself, okay? He's confirming to himself, he's wondering whether this is the same village, and he's saying himself, yes, this is the village I left yesterday. There stood the Catskill Mountains. The Catskill Mountains are still there, all right? There ran the Silver Hudson at a distance. I can see the Catskill Mountains. I can see the Silver Hudson. So yes, the Hudson River. So yes, this is the same place where I was yesterday. This is my village. There was every hill and dale precisely as it had been. So he is trying to recognize the village by the landscape around him. Rip was sorely perplexed. He was perplexed, he was lost, confused. That flagon last night, he thought, had addled my poor head sadly. That is, he's saying, the flagon, that is the liquor he had drunk. He says, the liquor that I have drank last night has addled my poor head sadly. He thinks that the liquor he drank did something to his brain, and this is why he couldn't recognize his village. He thought that something was wrong in his mind. Rip's heart died away at hearing. Oh, yes. So I have skipped more paragraphs here, and the paragraphs in which I have skipped show Rip as walking, meeting people, and asking about his friends. He was in the bar where he was in the beginning considered or taken for a spy because he was asking about George III, and then started asking about people, and he was told that all the people he knew died. Okay, so this is after he learned about the people who died. Rip's head died away at hearing of these sad changes in his home and friends, and finding himself thus alone in the world. Uh, every answer puzzled him by treating of such enormous lapses of time and matters which he could not understand. War, Congress, Stony Point, he discovered new words that he hadn't that he had never heard of before. He didn't know that there was a war. He doesn't know what the Congress is because the Congress was born after the war, the Stony Point, and so on. He had no courage to ask after any more friends, but he cried out in despair, "Does anyone here know Rip Van Winkle?" So he knows that all his friends had died, so he doesn't want to ask about anyone else, but he wants to know if anyone knows him. So, does anyone here know Rip Van Winkle? "Oh, Rip!" exclaimed two or three. To be sure, that's Rip Van Winkle yonder, leaning against the tree. Rip looked and beheld a precise counterpart of him. That is, when he looked, he found a precise counterpart. He found a precise imitation of himself sleeping by the tree. You know, he said in the beginning that he was very lazy and that he would often sit by the tree, okay? And somehow his son grew up to become the same lazy man who would sleep by by the tree, sorry. So people are showing him the other Rip, who was also sleeping by the tree. Rip looked and beheld the precise counterpart of himself. He found a precise imitation of himself. As he went up the mountain, apparently as lazy and certainly as ragged, the poor fellow was now completely confounded. He doubted his own identity and whether he was himself or another man. In the midst of his bewilderment, the man the man in the cocked hat demanded who he was and what's his name. "God knows," he exclaimed at his wits' end. "I'm not myself. I'm somebody else. That's me yonder. No, that's somebody else got in my shoes. I was myself last night, but I fell asleep on the mountain and they've changed my gun and everything's changed and I'm changed and I can't tell what's my name or who I am." Now, he doesn't recognize himself. He doesn't know what his name is and he is not sure if he is himself because he is looking at the exact imitation of himself in front of him. See? He couldn't recognize himself. He thought in the beginning that he was Rip, but he is now looking at Rip. Rip is sitting there in front of him, and he doesn't know himself. This is why he says, "I don't know who I am." Okay? It was later that he discovered that the man who was sitting by the tree was actually his son, and that he didn't know at the moment. He still doesn't know that he slept for 20 years and that his son has grown up and became an adult lazy man. Okay, so I stopped here with the text because the excerpt I have chosen here, or the set of paragraphs I have chosen here, summarize more or less the content of the story. The main things we have to focus on from this excerpt are the plot, because I haven't spoken of the plot, but we can see the plot development here. The plot develops gradually. In the beginning, we are told the things are presented clearly. We are told that he had a very simple living. He was someone who was loved by all people around him, and so on. Until one day he had a conflict with his wife. So the first conflict occurs here, which marks the beginning of the rising action of the plot. That is the first conflict with his wife. Actually, there have been many conflicts with his wife, and well, with every conflict, he will always walk to the mountain. But this particular conflict has changed things because it was on this day that he met these people. Okay? So this was the first conflict which marked the beginning of the rising action. The action develops, or the plot develops, and becomes a little more complicated as he is walking back to his village and hears the voices that are calling his name. So he follows the voices instead of walking home. Now, let's see things differently. What if Rip had ignored the voices and walked directly to his home? Would all this happen? No. Okay? If he didn't follow the voices, Nothing of all this would happen. He would just go back home. He would just listen to his wife's clamors, and things will happen the same way they always happen. They always do. Sorry. But today is different because instead of going back directly to his home, he followed the voice. So as he followed the voice, he found these strange people, supernatural creatures, and things started to become more complicated. Okay? So the plot develops as he is looking at these dwarfs, and then he drinks the liquor with them and sleeps for 20 years. After he woke up, things became more complicated as he is lost. He doesn't find his dog nor his gun. He goes back to the village and everything is confusing to him. I guess we can consider this as the climax of the story, or maybe this paragraph is best considered as the climax of the story, because he doesn't recognize himself. He doesn't recognize, he is even unable to tell his own name. He is confused, he is perplexed, he is looking at himself in front of him. He sees himself sleeping by the tree. So if that man sleeping by the tree is myself, then who I am. So the climax here is subject to perspective. Each of you can see the climax from their own perspective. To me, this is the most complicated point in the story. That is the most complicated point of the story, is the one in which Rip is entirely lost and confused, perplexed, and unable to know who he is. Some people will consider the climax of the story the moment in which he was considered as a spy and as a sympathizer with the British colony. Okay, so it's a matter of interpretation when we're talking about the climax, but both of them can be considered as a climax. And then the story revolves and finds resolution as Rip Van Winkle is introduced to his daughter, who tells him that his wife had died, that she is his daughter, and that the man who was sleeping by the tree was his son. So he feels relieved when he recognizes, or when he realizes, that he had slept for 20 years and that he is himself, and so on. Okay, when he discovers the truth about himself. Yet, by the end of the story, Rip is still unable to cope with the change, and he spends the rest of his life telling his story. He spends the end of his life speaking about how he went to the mountains, slept for 20 years, speaking about the dwarves that he met in the mountain, these supernatural creatures that he met in the mountain, and how his life became all confused and changed after the 20 years, how he was lost and perplexed in the beginning and could hardly find himself. Okay? Now, regarding the choice of the language, in the language, the register is archaic. Register is archaic and colloquial. There are many colloquial words here, like folk, like my lad instead of my friend, and some archaic words like the terms here, thy mistress, thou shalt, and so on. So the register in the text is merely archaic and colloquial, while the diction is merely Anglo-Saxon. Okay, since this is there are many references to the Dutch, the diction is merely Anglo-Saxon. Now, although there are some Latin origin words in the text, like personages, but most of the terms in the text are Anglo-Saxon. That is, the text is composed of Anglo-Saxon origin words more than Latin origin words. Let me see your questions. Kenza, he became stranger. Fatima, Ribbon was recognized everything by whom? Fatima, did you read the story? He was introduced to his daughter, and his daughter told him everything about his family. You should go back to the story in order to read all the details. What I have here is just a short excerpt. Okay, so I was speaking about the diction. I said the diction is a composition both of Anglo-Saxon origin words and Latin origin, although there are more Anglo-Saxon origin words than Latin. So to me, the diction is is Anglo-Saxon. It's very important to shed light on the characterization of the story. Rip Van Winkle is, of course, he is the protagonist. He doesn't look like the traditional protagonist in the novel. Usually, you know, the traditional protagonist is a very strong man. He's a hero. In Frankenstein or Modern Prometheus, for example, the protagonist was loved humanity. He was a scientist, but he felt anxious for human beings because he loved human beings very much and he wanted to save the human beings who were around him. He died of anxiety because he hurt the people who were around him and so on. So far, all the protagonists we have seen were very strong and they were self-centered and so on. While Rip is not like the protagonists we have seen before him. He is different from the traditional protagonist. He is a very simple man. He is handpicked. Uh, his intelligence is very limited. He's a very, very simple man. And this is the beginning of a new tradition in writing. Okay. Years later, there was the invention of what is known as the anti-hero. And the anti-hero is a very simple protagonist who doesn't do something heroic. Okay. Something like Rip Van Winkle. He's a very simple protagonist who doesn't do something great in his life. He doesn't save people from death. He doesn't live in anxiety because he loves human beings. He doesn't do great things or supernatural things. He's a very simple man. Okay. Rip is a round character because of because he's more lifelike and he's multidimensional. We have seen him as a very good man in the beginning. We have seen him as someone musing at the beauty of nature, but we've also seen him as someone perplexed and confused because he was lost. We've seen him grieving his dog and his gun. We've seen him dreading the idea of going back to his wife. We have seen him perplexed and because he couldn't recognize himself. So he's multi-dimensional, and this is why he's a round character. Okay. Now, on the other hand, if we would speak about the antagonist, yes, his wife is an antagonist because she was scaring him even after he woke up. Even after he went back to the village, he was still scared by the wife. So the wife is definitely an antagonist. Okay? And we have mentioned some of the figures of speech in the text. The text is really full of figures of speech. I have mentioned some of them, but there are so many others you can also speak about. The atmosphere in general, in the beginning, the atmosphere is optimistic. It's colorful and it's happy. It shows happiness. It shows tranquility and peace. Okay, especially in the part in which nature is described, you can feel a lot of tranquility and peace in this part. But then you can feel some melancholy and darkness at the moment Rip meets with the dwarves. So the atmosphere is changing to melancholy and darkness, and then the atmosphere is changing to darkness, deceit, and negativity, and even melancholy, perplexity, and so on, confusion. When he wakes up, he is first answered by the crows, and then he is lost. He doesn't recognize himself. He doesn't recognize anybody around him. So in the beginning, it's optimist, it's beautiful, it's merry, funny, and happy. And then it is peaceful and tranquil in nature. And then it transforms to melancholy and darkness as he meets with the dwarves. And then it becomes perplexed and confusing and dark and deceiving after he wakes up from his sleep. Okay? The tone, on the other hand, is, I think the tone is the same from the beginning to end, because all the time the author is referring to Rip as poor. Okay? So from the very beginning to the end of the story, the tone is that of sympathy and pity. Okay, you feel like Washington Irving feels sympathy for Rip Van Winkle. He feels sorry for him, and we feel that he likes him, and he loves, and he feels bad for him whenever something bad happens to him. Okay, I think this is all for the the themes. Yes, the most important part of the text. Well, we have talked about the themes in the beginning. I think we have talked about the themes for about an hour. The themes are still the same. There are the themes of the revolution here, in the fact that we see the character, or the character is depicted as henpecked and as ill-treated by the wife in the beginning, but then we see him getting rid of this pressure and discovering his liberation and his freedom at the end. So here you can find the theme of revolution and liberation. There is also the theme of tranquility and beauty of nature, the theme of peace that he finds in nature, because while sitting in nature, he feels good, he feels tranquil and peaceful. There is the theme of the supernatural. That is, we see supernatural creatures as creating a difference in his life. The theme of friendship between him and the dog, Wolf, and I don't know. If we can speak about any other themes. Maybe the theme of difference. I wouldn't say really the theme of difference, but coping with the change. Yeah, coping with the change, because he's not able to cope with the change. He's not able to adapt to the change, and he decides to stay in his small bubble. So his inability to cope with the change at the end of the story. Can we consider the people who were talking to Rip as antagonists? No, Kenza, you cannot consider them as antagonists, because they are not. They did not try to hurt him. Okay, they did not try to do something bad to him. Why? The antagonist is someone who is trying to hurt the protagonist. The antagonist is someone who's trying to do something bad to the protagonist. But this is not the case here. Sabrina themes freedom, progress, and the development of the world, or the alternation of the world. You do not say changement. Okay. So if you have no questions or no comments, I think we have come to the end of this session. We have spoken more or less about everything about the story. Rip Van Winkle. I also offered an overview of American literature and of the beginnings of American literature, the importance of the landscape and the landscape and symbolism and nationalism in the American literature. I'm going to share the book that I told you about earlier. This book is something that you must all have. This is a very interesting book because it not only speaks about the beginning of American literature, it also speaks of realism in American literature. And when you will start your third year, when you will start the syllabus of the third year, you are going to start with Daisy Miller by Henry James, and you're going to study Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. And there is an entire chapter in this book about realism in America, and particularly about Mark Twain and about about Henry James. The book also has something, a chapter entitled "The Invention of Race in American National Identity." It speaks of the Black narratives. And there are also the slave narratives, and these works are also included in your syllabus of the third year. That is, if you get the book, this is going to serve you as a great support for literature in the third year. Okay, this book is definitely going to help you with the literature of the third year, especially the American literature of the third year. Everything is explained here. There are actually two versions of the book. There is 19th, the one that I have here is 19th century American literature, and there is also 20th century American literature. I also have the 20th century American literature, and both of them are available in Shams Library. Okay, and if you get the two books, if you cannot get the two books, I can scan my book and share it with you. And both of them include the main themes and the main literary works that you are going to discuss in third year. So the book is definitely going to be useful to you. Let me see your questions. How about those who gave him the liquor? The creators. Now, the dwarves, they I don't see any symbolism in the dwarves, but to me they are participants in the action. They are the ones who made the supernatural actions, and they I think to me they are part of the aesthetic aspect of the text, because Washington Irving, the main goal of Washington Irving was to create a myth for America. It was to create a legendary, a story of legend and a story of and an aspect of mythology to add to the American canon, literary canon. So the reason why he had recourse to the supernatural creators here was just part of his wish to create the myth, if you see what I mean. Who is the audience? There is no particular audience here. Okay. He was writing for all the Americans, and there is no precise audience. You know, some books do have a precise audience, but not all the books have it. Okay. There's also the time and place settings, which I mentioned in the excerpt, which are the Catskill Mountains and the Hudson River. All the questions. The title of the book. Yes, Rada, I'm going to send you the cover of the book now in the conversation. I have just taken a picture of the book. I'm going to send the cover of the book. The book is entitled 19th Century American Literature, written by Roland Hughes. Okay, I'm just trying to find a way of sending, here's the picture. So I'm going to send you a picture of the cover of the book. Next question. Thank you for the session. It was helpful. You're very welcome. All right, I have sent you the cover of the book. It's coming. It has just arrived. So for next time, we're going to speak about Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, and that is going to be our last session together. Okay, but I definitely advise you or recommend you to get the book because it's very interesting. I'm going to publish some parts of the book, some pages from the book on Facebook so you can see them. And if you cannot find the book, you can tell me. I would speak to the library or try to get you a photocopy of the book. All right. So next time we're going to speak about Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher. So if you have no questions or no comments to add, thank you all for coming today, for sticking. We have stayed here for 3 hours. That was a record. Thank you for being so patient, for staying with me for 3 hours, and for giving me this chance to teach again, because I have been missing teaching. And I hope to see you soon.